I made this video after looking at the forum question that you see on the screen right now. This video walks through not only how to save personalized configuration information for DataGrid 2, but also how to manipulate that and change the display of DataGrid 2 with a microflow if you choose to do that. This forum question asked, how can I hide columns for which the user has not entered any search terms? And so I'll walk through in general how to save personalized configuration for DataGrid 2, and then specifically how to hide columns if there are no search terms. So let's go into Studio Pro, and what you'll see here is in my domain model, I've created a small wrapper entity to contain not only the configuration information, but also search terms from a DataGrid 2. This column will be JSON. These columns will be plain text. I've made all of these columns unlimited in size, and I've set up the access rules so that users can only see objects that they have created. The next thing I created is a simple microflow that tries to retrieve one of those configuration objects for the current user. If we find one of those in the database, we return it. If we don't find one, we create it. So there should only ever be one of these objects in the database for each user. And then I've created a simple page that has a DataGrid 2 inside of a data view with our configuration object. You can see that I populate that configuration object with the microflow that we just looked at. You can also see that this DataGrid 2 has 4 columns: supplier, contact name, phone number, and email. So this is a data grid of contacts at suppliers. And if I look at the configuration of this DataGrid 2, what I'll see in the Personalization tab is that I've chosen to store the configuration in an attribute. That attribute is this configuration attribute in my entity. And when there are changes, I've asked DataGrid 2 just to simply save changes to that. In a similar way, if I look at these filters, these text filters, you'll see that I've chosen to save my filter values into this attribute, and I've asked DataGrid 2 just to save changes when there are changes made. Finally, I've created a little page where we can go and view the contents of our configuration object. So we'll take a look at that. Let's now hop over into the browser and see what this looks like. So a couple of things. First, you can see in Studio Pro, supplier was the first column, but in my DataGrid 2, supplier is the second column because I've reorganized these. And also there are some search terms in here. And so you can see as I change search terms, the contents of the DataGrid 2 change. And just to show that this is saved into the database, I'll go over into another browser and I'll refresh this page, and you'll see that the search terms have now changed in a similar way. If I move the supplier column all the way to the beginning and change the width of some of these columns to make the display a little more friendly, and then move over to my other browser and refresh it, you'll see that all of those changes are here. And that's because this information is being stored in the database in our configuration object. Let's take a look at that configuration object. There's two things here. One is these are the search terms. So any information that's typed into those filters we'll see here. And then this configuration contains information about how the DataGrid 2 is displayed. So this JSON I've put into this little JSON widget, and we can kind of look through here and see what our contents look like. So first you can see here are the columns. Here's the size of them, whether or not they're hidden. Here's the sort order of the columns. So that would be if I have a sort on one of the individual columns, or more of the individual columns. And then here's the order of the columns. So you can see these are now ordered the way that we created them inside of Studio Pro. But just to demonstrate this, if I move email, which is the fourth column that we created in Studio Pro, to the beginning, then what you'll see is, if I go look at my config and expand this, you'll see that my column order is 3, 0, 1, 2. So that's how you can store configuration information for an individual user, or for each individual user, into the database for DataGrid 2. Now, let's move on to look at the specific question from the forum, which is, if I don't have a search term inside of the supplier search field here, can I hide this column programmatically? So I'll move back into Studio Pro, and I'll look at this microflow that I've created that will do that. So I pass in the configuration object. First, I check to see that there are some contents in the configuration attribute. That's our JSON. Actually, before I do this, I should point out I've created a JSON structure with the JSON that's stored for the DataGrid 2. And then I have an import mapping and an export mapping so that I can import the contents of that JSON into some objects, manipulate the contents, and then export those contents so that I can store them back into my configuration entity. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because that's a little bit outside the scope of this video. Okay, back to my microflow. I check to make sure I have some JSON. Then I put that JSON into a string variable. Then I import it so that I wind up with some non-persistable objects that I can manipulate in my microflow. Then I look in the supplier search terms and I see if they're empty. If they're empty, I want to go down this path so that I can hide that column. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be retrieving some objects, and I'll just go to my domain model here. And so what I want to get to is this hidden entity, so I can change that to false in this case. So I retrieve columns, then I retrieve a column list. Then I find the column that has the column ID of 0, which is the first column we created inside of Studio Pro. Then I change that. I change hidden from false to true. Once I've done that, I export my JSON using an export. So I take this mapping, this export mapping, and pass the root into it. And then I change my configuration object, and I put the updated configuration JSON in there. Just to show you what that looks like, how that works. Because I have search terms here now, I shouldn't see any difference when I click on this microflow. This is the microflow that we just looked at. And in fact, I don't. So the supplier column is not hidden. But if I change that now, so that I don't have any search terms in here, and do the same thing, now what you'll see is that the supplier column is hidden. So that's how you can manipulate the display of DataGrid 2 programmatically. Now, it's important to note here that my supplier column, I can still manually come in here and turn that on. So we haven't like removed that from the data grid 2. But that's just a simple example of how you can change usages of data grid 2 inside of your Mendix application. Hope this has been helpful.